So HIA is a process that we use in order to evaluate the change that is happening around us and its effect on heritage sites. Now, when we talk about change to heritage, it's not from a natural process or unpredictable events, but deliberately proposed actions or developments. It's important to understand that this is a tool. It's not a miracle which will ensure a development can go ahead. It's just a way to assess if the change is possible. What does HIA aim to achieve? Particularly with World Heritage properties, the terms such as integrity and authenticity are prevalent. The aim of an HIA is to safeguard the World Heritage outstanding universal value and heritage significance of heritage sites. It aims to reduce impacts to a level which are beneficial for heritage sites, or if it's negative, to try and remove it and make the impact acceptable. Most HIAs in Asia are carried out as a result of a requirement from international funding agencies, such as World Bank or Asian Development Bank. It can also come as a request from to the state parties from the World Heritage Committee when development is proposed on or near World Heritage sites. HIA can also be part of a statutory EIA process, while most countries in Asia have an EIA system. Often HIA is not part of that. Exceptions are Hong Kong and Taiwan, where there's a well-developed HIA system embedded in the EIA. The Heritage Impact Assessment System can be found or would be appropriate in items such as an environmental law or procedures for protecting public property, planning and zoning, land use law, building codes, or management plans. And on the other hand, they can also be propped up, supported by these various laws to make them more effective. What are the steps in the HIA process and who's involved? First of all, the actors of HIA. You have a project proponent, the person or the group that proposes the project and finances the heritage impact assessment. You have a heritage authority who looks after the strong governance and legislation for heritage, who issues construction and operation permits, and liaises with other authorities and other government departments on heritage significance and conservation. You have the Heritage Department who does the screening, scoping, who provides advice on heritage, reviews the HIA and endorses it, and ultimately monitors the implementation of any mitigation measures. You have the HIA practitioners. These are often private individual or groups, can also be institutions. They implement the HIA and all the steps of necessary. And then there's the public who promotes heritage awareness, needs access to heritage information, and needs to claim ownership of local and national heritage. So setting an HIA in motion, the initial steps after the project proponent proposes a development or an activity, it is screened by the Heritage Authority and is decided that it requires an HIA. The definition of and the scope of the HIA is conducted in the scoping phase, and then the HIA is awarded, first often tendered and then commissioned. So in a little bit more detail, screening. So the screening involves the review of all project proposals to identify which may have the potential to impact heritage resources. And if it has the potential to impact, then it requires a heritage impact assessment. So the screening can be carried out by environmental protection agencies, often in EIAs, but more appropriately it would be the heritage authorities. It can be the project proponent who decides that, or who are requested to identify whether their project will affect heritage. It can be the funding agencies or requested by the World Heritage Committee in cases of World Heritage. When a screening occurs, it may be applied to all development proposals, or it can be for projects which are located in or close by heritage sites. This often occurs for World Heritage. It can also be certain projects, type of projects such as road or sewer projects or housing developments of a certain size, or some projects with a certain budget can be needing a screening. So here are some of the examples of projects that could require an HIA. As I mentioned already, roads, bridges, could be tourism infrastructures, could be government infrastructure. It could be when a new market is built, or the renovation of certain buildings, in utilities infrastructure, water supplies, telecommunication, gas, all sorts of things like that, or in some cases religious associated developments, new monasteries, extensions of cemeteries, columbarium facilities, stuff like that. Once it has been decided that an HIA is required, the nature and the scale of the HIA must be determined. This is presented in a scoping report. Sometimes it's also called a study brief, terms of reference, or a project profile. A scoping report is most often prepared by the project proponent, often pushed by legislation, but drafted by a heritage impact assessment specialist, and ultimately it has to be agreed and endorsed by the heritage authority. The scoping stage is one of the most important phases in a heritage impact assessment. It is in the scoping report that, for instance, the study area for the heritage impact assessment needs to be defined. The study area, of course, will include the location or the footprint of the development, but it also may have to include a much larger area, depending on the type and the scale of the project. It is most important that the study area include all heritage resources which may be impacted. It is in the scoping report that the methodology for the HIA is identified. An HIA includes baseline information. The scoping report should identify if possibly additional data collection is required, such as an archaeological or survey or further historical research, where the site visits may be required. In a scoping report, we also identify the major or critical impacts, the possible major or critical impacts that may occur from the project. And we call this key issues. A stakeholder consultation is often mentioned in a scoping report. It will identify the organizations and communities to be consulted. A scoping report, depending on the type of heritage that is located within the study area, will have very specified expertise. For instance, if you are on a prehistorical site, you need a prehistorian. If you are doing something with buildings, then it will be useful to have an architect or a building surveyor. So a scoping report should at minimum include the following kind of headings. An executive summary, context or the background of a project, an overview of policy, legal and institutional framework applicable to not only the type of project, but also the heritage involved. It should include project descriptions, and for the project, alternatives should be considered. The scoping report will also include a description of the environment, together with illustrations such as maps, photographs, satellite images, whatever is appropriate for this HIA. It should identify the key issues, and with the key issues also the key potential heritage impacts, and if mitigation, initial assessment of if mitigation measures could be applicable. It should identify public consultation and disclosure mechanisms, and it can be summarizes the entire project at the end with some broad recommendations. So as mentioned before, the scoping report is where we define the study area or the area of influence. Also time boundaries, project phases and potential stakeholders. So we look at in which phase of the project heritage may be affected, such as construction phase or during operation. It starts the process of understanding applicable regulation and standards. It might not be comprehensive, but it already identifies the major legislation and protocols which need to be followed. It makes the provisional identification of heritage impact, as mentioned before, the key issues. Again, these will not be comprehensive. The actual heritage impact assessment will identify all impacts, but a scoping report will identify some of the major potential ones. It will provide an indication of the depth and breadth of the subsequent heritage impact assessment investigation. So will surveys be required? How much data collection and studies will be needed? This is important for the commissioning stage and the cost of the heritage impact assessment. It will also provide an opportunity for consultants, authorities, project developers to express their views and concerns regarding the project before the HIA proceeds. So again, it's not a static process, scoping report. It will be reviewed by all, but it needs to be endorsed by the Heritage Authority. So why are we making a scoping report? To enable an efficient and comprehensive assessment process later, and by identifying the steps in the scoping report, it will save time, resources, costs, and avoid delays. We also identify potential communities or types of heritage which may be affected in the scoping report. This slide considers the scoping reports for heritage impact assessments conducted for projects within World Heritage properties, which the methodology needs to focus on safeguarding the OUV and the attributes that convey that OUV. The scoping report will have to be endorsed or approved by the World Heritage Centre. In contrast, heritage impact assessments for areas that include World Heritage properties but are not the main focus, it could be in the buffer zone or just outside World Heritage properties. Although in this the focus will not be as much on the OUV. It still has to be taken into consideration in these types of HIA, and in this case the Heritage Authority will approve the scoping report and may have to send it later to the World Heritage Centre just to ensure that World Heritage was considered. So in a scoping report, again, it's very important that the location of the development site is described and includes a detailed or a clear map of the location. It should identify the heritage sites which may or may not be affected, and last but not least, the proposed development and associated works. So heritage impact assessments are often undertaken by heritage managers, and so we are not always engineers or designers, and so it is imperative that the development and possible associated works are understood in the context of how it may affect heritage. This kind of leads into how the study area is determined, because if you are thinking direct impacts from a project, such as excavation on an archaeological site or near a heritage monument, which causes vibration and it can fall down, it's quite an obvious impact. But we also need to consider things like visual impacts, which may occur over a much larger area. So if a large tower, a high tower is being proposed, then the area of influence of the development is going to be much wider than, for instance, the excavation for a foundation. Although scoping reports are often drafted by HIA practitioners, it is important to identify what expectations the Heritage Authority has from the Heritage Impact Assessment. This is a clear message to the project proponent, but also to the HIA team, which will implement the assessment. So scoping report again should include whether surveys are required, is the existing data sufficient to make an assessment. It needs to define which heritage will be included in the HIA and their possible legal status. So what type of information would be required to undertake the HIA? And this again harks back to the finances. If the scoping report doesn't identify that, I'm just, for example, a LiDAR survey is required, if that is not stated, then who is going to pay for it? The scoping report may also include what possible impacts in very tentative way are possible, and during which stage, what should be highlighted in the ultimate HIA report. Finally, the scoping report needs to identify who should be on the HIA team. Once the scoping report has been endorsed, then the project proponent can move on to commissioning an expert team to conduct the heritage impact assessment. I said the project proponent can continue to hire an HIA team, but this doesn't have to be as such. It could be the Heritage Authority who appoint a team. It could be the funding agency who appoints a team, or it could be the project proponent. For the funding agencies or the project proponent, the team has to be approved by the Heritage Authority. This is to ensure that the quality of the HIA will be as expected and as set in the scoping report. The commissioned HIA team must have the appropriate professional qualifications and experience to conduct the HIA. The HIA team must be allowed full access to information required for the completion of the HIA. This is not only heritage information, this is also all details pertaining to the development or the action that is the project. The scoping report will have identified the task required to complete the HIA. the outputs, the time frame, the expertise, and so this should aid in the budgeting of the HIA. So in cases where there's a competitive tendering process, the bids that cannot complete the task identified in the scoping report should be rejected. We should clearly look at the expertise, the manpower, and the experience of the team. So this is a flow chart of a HIA system, a simple HIA system. So the project has been set. We have a scoping report for it. The team has been commissioned, and so the HIA starts. There will be a desk-based review first, if necessary. Data collection will be undertaken. Once there is sufficient data, we can move on to making an assessment of the project on heritage and recommend possible mitigation measures. Now, mitigation measures, they can be implemented prior to the construction phase, during, or after, during the operational phase. So it kind of leads the HIA implementation to an environmental permit. And an environmental permit is something that has to be issued by the Heritage Authority before the construction can go ahead. We'll come back to the other elements in the flowchart later. The quality of a heritage impact assessment is largely based on its baseline data collection. So this step is really essential. So initially we identify what type of heritage, location, descriptions, conditions of the heritage, all these, anything pertaining to the significance of the heritage is collected in the baseline study. But also we have to understand what is the project. Is there a need for this project? What's its area of influence? What type of works are proposed or will be undertaken? What type of machinery does that involve? What's the design of the project and its possible impact on heritage? Because all this information regarding the project and the heritage will ultimately lead into evaluation of heritage significance and the identification of impacts and assessment of the project. So the HIA implementation will include a report, and the report will describe the steps that the HIA study takes. So initially, as mentioned before, the baseline study, which establishes heritage significance and identifies existing impacts, not only on the heritage, but also within the study area. It will identify potential impacts from the development and then evaluates the effects of the project, of the works on the heritage and heritage significance. It will ultimately recommend mitigation measures where possible and includes a monitoring and audit program to be implemented after the environmental permit has been issued. The baseline study includes documentation, collecting and collating to understand the current baseline situation within the study area and for the heritage. So type, number and distribution of the heritage resources as revealed through existing information and possible additional data acquisition. Existing information can consist of historical documents, secondary works, environmental, ecological, geological, geomorphological information, ancient and modern map collections and studies of these, historical photographs, archival documents, previous archaeological, built heritage or landscape studies, published papers, and so forth, existing catalogues and inventories and project reports and previous or related assessment reports. If the existing information is found lacking, then additional data collection may be required. It will be conducted to fill in any gaps in the database and expand where needed using things such as archaeological investigations, built heritage or landscape surveys, and interviews, collection of oral histories. So the baseline study should be detailed enough to provide a project baseline against which the monitoring results can be compared. What was the significance of the heritage before, and has this been safeguarded now that the project is up and running? Once we report on the baseline study, we should identify where there are still gaps in the data and why these gaps could not be filled. There was no time, there was no access, there was not enough funding. We should also identify during data acquisition if there were negative results. So this is an area where the survey did access but found nothing, and so this negative information also helps towards the assessment. So a quick reminder of what types of heritage resources that we could possibly be looking at. Tangible heritage, including archaeology, built heritage and cultural landscapes. Intangible heritage, where we'd be looking at traditional handicrafts, ways of life, festivals, practice, and traditional industries. So we've identified the heritage resources in the baseline data, and so it's time to evaluate their heritage significance. Often this is already known as part of a national or local registered heritage, but it can be, if it's a World Heritage property, then it's identified in the Outstanding Universal Value Statement. But if the heritage significance is not known, then it will have to be evaluated based on a pre-agreed set of criteria. Pre-agreed because assessing sites and defining the significance of heritage can be highly subjective and may also raise many questions from other groups. It's therefore important to be transparent, involve crucial stakeholders in the process, and agree what set of criteria will be used to evaluate heritage. So it can be the significance can be based on a type of heritage. You rank it. It can be certain countries have priorities when defining what their heritage is. Not only countries, but also institutions and development priorities may lead the evaluation or the ranking of heritage. And then, of course, outstanding universal value, where the heritage significance is set. So one of the approaches for determining heritage is single value. So you compare the value or the significance of one site against others. To do this, both a site's quality, how significant is the site, and its quantity, how many of the other type, how many of this type of sites exist, have to be considered. That's one way of doing it. It can also be led by political or ideological choices. Can lead a country to say, okay, we want to or we don't want to highlight colonial sites. We do want to highlight this religion or this ethnic group, but not others, for instance. It can also be led by the economical value of a heritage. It has a high potential for attracting tourism, so we are going to consider this of a higher value. It can be the other way around as well, is that development priority takes precedence over the type of heritage within a certain area, And so it's more important to, for instance, do mining than to protect the heritage. So this is a single value approach. The reality is, of course, that each heritage site has far more than one value to consider. And one of the examples that I'm giving here is the Paku Caves near Luang Prabang. It's a cave that has a high attraction for tourism, so it's an economical value as real estate, but it's spiritual as a place of worship, historical because it is several hundred years old at least. There's an aesthetic value to it because it has a beautiful form and its architecture, and an archaeological value as a place used over time. I'm not going to go into details of how to evaluate heritage significance, but as I said, it has to be a pre-agreed set of criteria, and this slide shows a set of criteria which is used by Heritage New Zealand. They look at condition of the site, the rarity, contextual value, the information potential, amenity value, cultural associations, and then anything that may add to the heritage significance. So, but this is only one example. There's many others. In the day 2, we will look at a bit more details of how to conduct the evaluation of heritage significance. So we've got our baseline data, we have identified the significance of our heritage, and then we need to look at what sort of potential impacts there may be from the development. It's very difficult to kind of illustrate this because each project is different. It may be a tourist activity, it may be a construction of a building, it could be a road construction, or mining, or a wide variety of type of impacts. And so that has to be considered on an individual basis. But once we understand what type of potential construction or operation or impacts may arise from the project, we can move on to an assessment. Now, there's different types of impacts. There could be direct, indirect, residual, cumulative. We will look at that in a minute. Also, the timing and duration of the impact is quite important. Are the impacts during construction, operation, or decommissioning phase? All this information will lead to the acceptability of the impacts, which can range between beneficial and unacceptable. The direct impacts on heritage resources are impacts which cause measurable change to the fabric or materials of a resource, or, in the case of intangible heritage and practices, results in measurable changes to the performance. Indirect impacts are impacts which don't directly affect the heritage resource, but alter its environment, setting, or context in ways that ultimately affects the resource itself. So we see an example of coastal erosion and an example of change to the environment. Cumulative impacts are a progressive alteration or destruction of a site resulting from repetitive impacts. Repetitive, but not necessarily similar. So cumulative impacts occur over a time and are the results of a combination of various impacts that individually may not appear to be causing significant damage. So the example provided below is the construction of a farm, and then ultimately the construction of the road leading to the farm leads to ribbon development and extensive damage of a landscape or an archaeological site, for instance. Residual impacts is something that after the mitigation measures have been implemented are impacts that still remain and cannot be taken away. But residual impacts are so minor that they are considered to be acceptable in most cases. So just to summarize, residual impacts are impacts that remain after the implementation of mitigation. So after the type of impacts, we consider the timing of the impacts. So some examples here of construction phase impacts on archaeological sites and built heritage. Impacts can occur during the operation phase, in a sense where tree plantations have an ongoing impact on archaeological deposits, or the construction of a modern tower amidst a cultural landscape continues to have visual impacts on this landscape. HIAs are not only conducted at the initial stages of a project, they can also come at decommissioning phase. So once a facility has reached the end of its useful lifespan, it will be vacated and possibly removed. During this removal, it may include further excavation of soil or building demolition works. Some of the examples we see here of machinery employed in decommissioning, or the revealing of archaeological structures during the decommissioning of an old airport. So we've identified the types of impacts, we've identified the timing of the impacts. We will also look at the duration of impacts and then come to an assessment. So what we are hoping for is that the project will have a beneficial impact on heritage. It happens. In this example that we're seeing here is that by the construction of a retaining wall, which prevents river erosion, actually protects a Pew monument from further erosion. So the impact is beneficial if a project will complement the setting or stabilize or enhance its function or accessibility or improve the maintenance and management of a heritage. So an acceptable impact consists of an impact which neither is negative or positive for heritage. The assessment indicates that there will be no significant effects on the fabric, setting, or value of a heritage place, and or the function and performance of intangible heritage. The examples used here is the resurfacing of a road, which just keeps the status quo of the area around the heritage, or the operation phase of a fiber optic network, where we see some residual impact, but really no negatives on the heritage. Unacceptable impacts are impacts which are so adverse that they are that we are unable to mitigate them practically. So the example provided here is a project which considered constructing telecommunication towers right next to a heritage monument. So an unacceptable impact, we would try and find alternatives. And in this case, we would say, find a new location, and we will go through the data collection, the identification of possible impacts, and the whole HIA steps again to get rid of the unacceptable impact and to come to something that we can work. Most commonly, though, we will find that the impacts are acceptable with mitigation measures. So impacts are acceptable with mitigation if there will be some adverse effects, but they can be eliminated, reduced, or offset to a large extent through specific recommended measures. So mitigation is required for all impacts that are defined as acceptable with mitigation. So we do not recommend mitigations for acceptable impacts or unacceptable impacts, for instance. So mitigation can be applied during any of the phases of the project, whether it be construction, an operation, a decommissioning, or even a planning stage. Mitigation should be recommended with the immediate and long-term safeguarding of the heritage resources in mind. It has to be realistic and provide viable alternatives. Examples of some of archaeological mitigation measures are an archaeological watching brief, which is typically conducted during the construction phase, or preservation by record of the archaeological data, which is something that would be recommended prior to the construction phase. Some examples of built heritage mitigation measures where, for instance, during the design stage, the built heritage is incorporated into the development, or during the construction phase where we see there are measures undertaken to ensure the stability of the built heritage resource. So how is mitigation implemented? We see that in the HIA report, we will include details on the mitigation measures. What needs to be done, when does it need to be done, where does it need to be done, by who. So it will be very detailed and very specific, so everybody involved understands what is expected and what is accepted. The party responsible for ensuring the mitigation measures are being implemented is the Heritage Authority, and that will be conducted during monitoring and audit stage. So monitoring and audit. So if mitigation measures are required, they have to be implemented, and the implementation needs to be ensured. It's often the Heritage Authority who monitors the mitigation measures implementation, but sometimes it can also be an expert who then reports to the Heritage Authority. So this monitoring is a process of regular observation, recording and reporting of the activities recommended in the HIA report. So this happens in the field to ensure compliance, and these mitigation measures are written into the construction and operation contracts, and as such will be effective. So the monitoring and audit process is necessary to determine the project compliance with the requested requirements and standards. It's to verify that the predicted impacts are mitigated. It is to ensure the effectiveness of the mitigation measures, but also to take remedial actions if there are unexpected problems or unacceptable impacts arising. So as mentioned before, heritage impact assessment processes are only well established in places such as Hong Kong and Taiwan. But when we look at existing protocols in a number of countries, there may be already systems which assess developments, which have a way of ensuring qualified practitioners, that there is already a kind of a permit system for development, and the monitoring of these development. So quickly, because my time is running out. We again have the flow chart for the HIA system, and the aim for the HIA report is to get to an environmental permit. This flowchart shows the HIA process and who is responsible for the various steps of HIA implementation. So we start with the application of the project by the project proponent. This, of course, is at screening stage, and it's here that the Heritage Department decides that an HIA is not required or that an HIA is required. Now, this flowchart has two sides. It was developed for the start of HIA in Myanmar. And at the start, often there are no HIA practitioners available yet, and so it would be the Heritage Department, and in this case DOA, the Department of Archaeology, who conducts HIA in-house. We're going to leave this side of the flowchart and just pretend that we have HIA practitioners available. So once it has been determined that an HIA is required, the project proponent will hire an approved consultant to prepare the scope of HIA, or the Heritage Department will prepare the scoping report themselves. So if it's a HIA practitioner, then the Heritage Department will approve it and will issue the final study brief, which will go out for tendering and for the project proponent to hire and appoint a consultant. This could be from an approved list, or in any case, the consultants will have to be approved by the Heritage Department. So once approved, the HIA will be undertaken and an HIA draft report prepared. The draft report will be submitted to the Heritage Department for review and comment. It also will be submitted to other stakeholders, other government departments, and the public for comments and suggestions. These comments will be incorporated into a final HIA report, which will have to be approved by the Heritage Department. The final HIA report will also include a mitigation and measures and monitoring plan. Ultimately, once it's approved, a permit will be issued by the Heritage Authority. So once the permit has been issued, the construction phase can commence. So of course the Heritage Impact Assessment Report can say no mitigation is required, but most often some form of mitigation will have to be implemented. The implementation of the mitigation will be conducted by a specified team or experts who will be engaged by the project proponent or appointed by the Heritage Department and paid for by the project proponent. The implementation of the mitigation, the responsibility of that lies with the Heritage Department. So we are here in the phase of implementing the mitigation. So this implementation will be monitored, as I said, by the department, the Heritage Department, and it will confirm that the measures have been followed, and then a final issue of compliance for the construction phase will lead into that the development may start its operation. If there is a non-compliance, then the project proponent must take action and remedial action in order to again achieve the certificate of compliance and get the operation of the project going. So this concludes my presentation, and I hope it has shed some light on